What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we diving into some budget Explorer decks that I've thrown together here as we dive further into the Explorer format in MTG Arena. I typically do these for Standard, and I figure since we're kind of newish to Explorer, we kind of dive into some maybe budget options for players who maybe are also trying to get into Explorer as well. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. The first deck up on this list is going to be Simic Flash. Simic Flash is a great deck to get into when it comes to playing tempo style Magic in the Explorer format. It's a great deck that consists of a ton of counter spells and a lot of things that can be cast during your opponent's turn. The main card that really helps this deck really put pressure on your opponent is going to be Nightpack Ambusher. It's a 4-mana 4/4 Flash Wolf that gives other wolves we control +1/+1. And at the beginning of our end step, if we didn't cast a spell during our turn, we get to create a 2/2 Wolf. And this is kind of the whole idea of the deck, is to kind of keep the battlefield as clean as possible, resolve with Nightpack Ambusher, and take over that way by creating this big wolf army that your opponent really can't deal with. Other than that, the only other rare in the deck is going to be Hinterland Harbor, and I do think it's key, especially in Eternal formats, to have lands on the battlefield untapped. I know you can play some dual lands that come to the battlefield tapped if you're a little bit more on a budget and you don't have the wild cards currently to craft, but I would say if anything, when it comes to upgrading the deck, I would say the first thing you want to do in any Explorer deck is probably look at what lands that are in those colors that come to the battlefield untapped and probably craft those cards. Hinterland Harbor is probably a really good one because of the basics that we're going to be playing. This is probably the best one that we can get on the battlefield and come to the battlefield untapped, because it doesn't come to the battlefield. It comes to the battlefield untapped if we control an island or a forest. Other than that, other things you can look at to upgrade the deck is things like Brazen Borrower. It's a nice 3-drop, 3/3 flash flyer that also has the ability of Petty Theft on the adventure side, meaning that you can return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, which is definitely very good. It's a nice 2-for-1. Also a flash speed spell, which is definitely great. You have Memory Deluge if you want to have a better card to dig a little bit deeper into your deck and find cards that you really need to help kind of either find the Ambusher or find counter magic is always very good. You can add in Otawara, so if you're coming from Standard, maybe already own a copy of this, just replace Island with an Otawara. That's definitely very good there. Same thing if you own Baseyu, just replace a forest with Baseyu. It's definitely good to disrupt, because there are artifacts that exist in the format, and this is definitely a good way to interact with said artifacts. Pathway is very good. Cut down on some forests and islands to add in the pathways. But Botanical Sanctum is a very good aggressive land as it creates blue or green mana. And then you also have Breeding Pool, which is another great dual land in the fact that it counts as a forest and an island. It comes to battlefield untapped if you pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters battlefield tap and produces blue and green. Also counts as a forest island, which is definitely very good for things like Hinterland Harbor that needs to make that check in order to come into the battlefield untapped. But overall, this is definitely a great deck if you like I said, that tempo style of Magic to get into. So the next deck up on this list is going to be Rakdos Sacrifice, and this is actually a pretty top meta deck if you actually have it fully fledged out in all the rares and mythics that typically this deck needs to have. But you do have a lot of key pieces of this deck in the uncommon and common slots for the most part, and that's definitely very good. The two main pieces I would say that are in this deck that really make this deck work is one going to be Mayhem Devil. If you resolve this and are able to get in the sacrifice train, you can start pinging your opponent for 1 point of damage, or pinging their creatures or planeswalkers for 1 point of damage, which is definitely very good. Combine that with things like Cauldron Familiar, a card that comes in the battlefield. Opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life, you get to sacrifice a food token, you return this back from the graveyard to the battlefield. And the way we make food tokens is with Witch's Oven, and we can sacrifice the food and get the cat back. And in this chain, we can essentially we can sacrifice the food, deal 1 damage, get the cat back, sacrifice the cat to the oven, get a food, so on and so forth. Definitely a very good thing there. If we are doing this, Oni Cult Anvil is another great card to have in the deck because we're sacrificing artifacts to get the cat back. We are more than likely going to be able to get these 1/1 tokens if we need them. Other outlets in the deck to help us sacrifice are things like Deadly Dispute. We have Experimental Synthesizer that comes about, helps us dig a little bit deeper. Also can be sacrificed and create a token if we need so. Claim the Firstborn is always a great card, especially if you want to be aggressive with the sacrificing, as it's something that's going to take your opponent's creature for only 1 mana, and we can always throw their creature into the oven and sacrificing at them to frustrate our opponent. Outside of that, the only rares I do have in the deck are actually a total of 6, and if you play Standard, you may have 2 of them. 2 of them being the Sulphurous Springs. You can just replace this with a Swamp and a Mountain if you don't have any copies, and the other one being Dragon Skull Summit, like the previous deck. This is a very solid land to have for this color, as it's probably the best dual land to have, especially if you're playing heavier on the basics, because it comes to the battlefield untapped if you control a mountain and or a swamp. Other than that, this deck is pretty straightforward. If you played Oni Cult Anvil in Standard, this is very similar to it, but you're just adding the addition of Mayhem Devil and Cat Oven. And other than that, it's a great deck to check out. And then in the sideboard, most of the cards that we have in here are just cards that are just very, very good. As you notice here, one card being Croxa. This is not something you need to have 4 copies of. 1 or 2 copies is probably pretty fine. You just probably cut down on, let's just say something like the Voldian Epic here or something like that to add this in. Next card up is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's a solid card, even not in standard, so it's definitely a good card to have as well. You probably can cut down on some other maybe like the synthesizer, if that's something that you think that it's not really working out. Just add in 4 copies of Fable of the Mirror Breaker as you get them. And then in the mana base, you have creature lands, which are always very good. So you have Hive of the Eye Tyrant, which is a great solid land. You probably want 1 or 2 copies of this. Den of the Bugbear, same thing, 1 or 2 copies. And since they're monocolored lands, you just cut out monocolored. You cut down your basics a little bit. You got Blightstep Pathway, cut down your basics even further, add 4 copies of this. Blood Crypt, cut down your basics even further, add 4 of these just because it's another solid land. And then you have Haunted Ridge as well, because this deck is a little bit more of a mid-range deck. This is a solid land to have because this is one that's going to come to the battlefield, more than likely untapped if you are later in the game. Worst case scenario, you play it early, tapped, and it's not a big deal. And if you want, you can also add in 2 more copies of Sulphurous Springs to make you add a solid mana set of 4. And the goal here is to probably be roughly around 24 lands, so it's definitely very possible to be mostly non-basics and just have a couple basics left after all is said and done. But definitely a very solid deck if you are into the sacrifice style of deck. Definitely check this one out. Now getting into something a little bit more aggressive, here we have Mono Red Burn. Mono Red Burn is a great budget deck because most of the burn spells that exist in these Eternal formats are more on the uncommon and common side, and because we have access to all of them, we are able to play all of them in our deck, and we definitely take good full advantage of this. And a lot of what we have in the deck are things like Wizard's Lightning, which deals 3 damage, can cost 1 mana if we control a wizard. Skewer the Critics, that could cost 1 mana if we've already dealt damage with the Spectacle ability. Lay at the Stage is a good way to dig a little bit deeper. It can cost 1 mana if we've already done damage to our opponent. You got Lightning Strike here, 4 copies of. You have Play with Fire. And then you have a lot of creatures that can be very aggressive very early. Swift Spear, Phoenix Chick. Lava Runner, if we have things in our graveyard, comes in the battlefield with +1/+0 and haste. If we control, if there are 2 more instants or sorcery cards in our graveyard. Pyromancer just comes in the battlefield and deals 2 damage to target player or planeswalker. Just overall, very, very aggressive deck. Everything costs relatively cheap, and most of what is the 3-drops are going to cost you more than likely less than what they are on the card. So you're either going to pay 1 mana for them, which makes this overall very, very effective. When it comes to rares, the only rare I have in the deck is a Soulscar Mage as just a very aggressive 1-drop that if you ever have to burn a creature, even if the creature is bigger, it's going to put -1/-1 counters on that creature instead of dealing that damage. So the counters are going to stay. So that creature is going to be forever weakened unless that creature leaves the battlefield for any reason. And this deck is pretty straightforward on what you need to have in it to upgrade. Some options could be Eidolon of the Great Revel. It's a 2-mana spirit. 2/2 that whenever a player casts a spell with mana value 3 or less, it deals 2 damage to that player. So it's going to penalize your opponent for casting their cheap spells in a format where a lot of spells in the format are cheap. Bone Crusher Giant is another great 2-for-1 kind of spell with 2 damage on the stomp side, 3 mana for the 4/3 side. That if it gets targeted by a spell, it's going to deal 2 damage to that player, which makes it very hard to get rid of unless they have some sort of global effect. Chandra is another great card for the deck as both its pluses are definitely very good for what we're trying to do. The first +1 adds red mana, deals 1 damage up to 1 target player or planeswalker. The second +1 is going to exile top card of our library if it's red when we cast it this turn. Both being very, very good. Den of the Bugbear and Sokuzan make it here. Creature lands are great for burn decks because this helps us put pressure on the battlefield. If your opponent's able to deal with the battlefield, they'll have to then also deal with this. Sokuzan, same thing. You can channel it for 4 mana and get 2 1/1 spirit creature tokens with haste. Both very, very good. But overall, this deck is pretty straightforward, mostly on the budget side, and very fun to play if you are into that type of Magic. Continuing on with the more aggressive decks of the format that are budget friendly is going to be Boros Heroic. This is definitely a fun deck. If you were around for the Strixhaven thing, this is a deck that takes advantage of targeting your creatures with spells, and they get pumped up in doing so. A couple of the key cards in the deck that kind of help it out is one going to be the 10th District Legionnaire, 2 mana 2/2 with haste. That whenever a spell we cast targets it, put a +1/+1 counter on it and get the scry 1. So if the thing puts a +1/+1 counter on it, it's going to get that +1/+1 counter, this +1/+1 counter, and then you get to look at the top part of your library. And if it's something that you need, you keep it on top. If it's something you don't need, throw it on the bottom. Another card that's in the deck is going to be the favorite Hoplite. It's a 1 mana 1/2 with Heroic that whenever you cast a spell that targets it, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you get to prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn. So it makes it a great aggressive attacker as it's going to grow bigger and bigger the more spells you target it with, and then on top of it, you can prevent damage that is dealt to it. So you swing in, even if your opponent has like a 3/3 and you make it a 3/4, it's gonna not take any of that damage, which makes it very good as well. Other than that, most of the deck is just full of cheap cantrip type spells that cost 1 or 2 mana, really to kind of protect your creatures or be very aggressive when they need to be. It's overall pretty cheap, as the only rares in the deck are going to be the Clifftop Retreats, just because, like I said with previous decks, you want to stay aggressive, and this is the best way to stay aggressive, especially when you're light on other non-basic lands, and this is probably the best non-basic to have for the Explorer format if you are heavy on the basics. When it comes to upgrades, the only real creature upgrade that you really need to have is going to be the Dreadhorse Arcanist, because this is a card that's going to allow us to recast things from our graveyard. If its power is less than the Dreadhorde Arcanist, most of our things that we're going to cast from the graveyard are more than likely going to be only 1 mana. Make this card very, very good. Itself also has Trample, definitely good as well. And this is just something you probably want to get rid of the Vanguards and add in these as kind of replacements. And then the rest of the upgrades are just add in some additional non-basic lands. Ganjo's here, good for spot removal. For the most part, is really good. You got Battlefield Forge. You can add these in here if you already own them from Brothers War. You got Inspire and Vantage, another great aggressive land. Pathways, also very good. And then you got Sacred Foundry, just another great solid dual land as well. And like I said, this deck is pretty low to the ground. It's very quick and definitely get big creatures very, very quickly. So if you've ever played that style of Magic, this is definitely a very similar Explorer style deck, just in the Boros colors. And the last deck here on the list is going to be Mono Blue Mill. Mono Blue Mill is kind of one of those decks that people either love or you hate. There's never really any in between. And this is definitely a solid deck list, as we have all of the uncommon and common mill cards that exist in the Explorer format. The only rare being in the deck is going to be Drowned Secrets, which is kind of one of those spells that whenever we cast a blue spell, target player mills 2 cards, and our deck is just full of blue spells, so it's either creature spells, mill spells, or even our planeswalker. Overall, very, very straightforward deck. All the cards kind of mill your opponent. Probably the best uncommon in this deck that really helps mill your opponent early is going to be Rune Crab. Every time you play a land, you're going to mill your opponent 3 cards. We play search lands in our deck just for the sake of being able to mill our opponent not just 3 cards, but 6 cards in a given turn, making this card even better. And the more you have of these out, the bigger chunks of cards you're going to take out your opponent's library. Other than that, every other card is just pretty straightforward. It mills your opponent in some sort of way. It gives you some sort of advantage. Ashiok's a great card to have in the deck as a planeswalker, being only uncommon, which is definitely very good, because spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search our library. So if your opponent has like a fetch land or something like that, they're not going to be able to search their library, or a spell that looks in their library for a card of particular thing, they're not gonna be able to search for it. And on top of that, we can -1 it, and target player mills 4 cards, and then they exile each opponent's graveyard. So if your opponent's playing some sort of graveyard strategy, we're not gonna get taken over by us milling our own opponent's deck and kind of helping them out. This is gonna exile those things from the graveyard, making that much better. And like I said, this deck is very budget friendly. Not outside of those Drowned Secrets, not really too many other rares and mythics you need to really make this deck work. And because it's a monocolor deck, we really don't need to have any super crazy cards in the deck. Land-wise, to really make the lands work. Only a couple of cards you can look at if you want to upgrade this deck any further. First one being Maddening Cacophony. This is a great mill card. For 2 mana, we get to mill 8 cards if the spell was kicked. Instead, mill opponent's library halfway, round it up. And you probably just go ahead and remove Compel an Argument and just add that instead, because they both mill for 2 mana. This one mills 3 additional cards with the upside of milling additional cards later in the game. Other than that, you have Tasha's Hideous Laughter, another great mill spell, because Explorer is probably on the cheaper side, unless you're against a deck that's like a control deck that has more expensive spells. This is going to exile cards from the top of the player's library until that player is exiled for an mana cost of total or 20 or more. Great solid mill spell that definitely works very well with this deck. And that one, you probably could either get rid of things like Ashiok if you want to. You could also look at maybe cutting down on some of your little 1-drops if you feel like that's probably where you want to go. And then the last card is going to be Vantress Gargoyle. It's just a solid creature to have in a mill deck, as this is one of those cards that benefits us from milling our opponent. It can't attack unless defending player has 7 more cards in the graveyard. We have a lot of ways to get 7 more cards in the graveyard, and then we can tap it, and each player mills a card, so it just kind of helps us mill in a way if it can't attack or block. But overall, this deck is pretty straightforward. If you love mill, this is definitely a deck for you. With that being said, I mean, these are some very decent entry-level decks if you're looking to get into the Explorer format. They're not going to be top meta-breaking decks, especially when you're playing with limited commons and uncommons, but they are definitely very approachable, and depending on where you are and how much collection you have in Standard, there's a good chance you may own half of the cards in most of these decks for the most part, or even playing Standard for a while. you may already also own them because of that. But with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, I'll see you in the next video. If you're liking the content on the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps out a lot. Also, if you want to go the extra mile, you can simply click the join button. You can join the channel and become a member for as little as $1. That will also help support the channel.